Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1891 in the Ozark Mountains seemed more unforgiving than usual. A bitter cold hung over the valleys and ridges like a heavy shroud, seeping into the walls of the isolated homesteads scattered throughout Taney County, Missouri. It was a cold that forced people to huddle close to their fires, that made conversations sparse and measured. But for those who lived near the Langley cabin on Cutter's Ridge, the silence wasn't just from the cold. The property belonged to Josiah Langley, a widower of 72 years, descendant of one of the first families to settle in the area. The cabin stood apart from other structures in the region due to its imposing size, with a wide front porch supported by hand-hewn oak posts, tall windows protected by wooden shutters, and a clearing in the back that, according to neighbors, had once been a thriving garden. Now, however, brambles overtook the abandoned plots, and wild vines climbed the weathered walls, casting shadows that seemed to move at dusk. County records from that time describe the residence as having been built in 1857 by Montgomery Langley, father of Josiah, during the prosperous years before the war. The architecture mixed traditional Appalachian craftsmanship with unique innovations Montgomery had brought back from his travels east. According to documents from the period, the cabin and outbuildings occupied approximately 2 acres of cleared land and featured a main floor, a small upper loft, and an extensive root cellar that, curiously, occupied only half the area beneath the structure. It was common for travelers to quicken their pace when passing the property, especially after sunset. There wasn't a specific reason for this, at least not one that could be clearly articulated. It was more a feeling, a subtle discomfort, as if the cabin watched those who passed by. Interviews conducted by historian Jeremiah Porter in 1953 with elderly residents of the region reveal that even before Josiah's disappearance, the cabin had earned a peculiar reputation. Winifred Haskell, a midwife who worked for various families in the county, reported, "That cabin was always different. Even when Josiah's wife Constance was still alive, there was something strange there. The linens I handled always had an odor, not common dirt, but something like damp earth and dried herbs, even when freshly washed. And Mr. Langley always handed me my payment at the door, never allowing me past the threshold." The official story, the one recorded in county ledgers, was straightforward. Josiah Langley lived alone following the death of his wife Constance, which occurred in 1877. Without heirs, he dedicated himself to managing the property left by his father and was rarely seen in town. His public appearances were limited to Sunday services at Cutter's Ridge Chapel, always dressed in black, always seated in the same pew, always alone. The details surrounding Constance's death, though apparently well documented, present intriguing inconsistencies. According to the official death certificate, signed by Dr. Abraham Finch on January 12, 1877, the cause of death was recorded as cardiac arrest resulting from winter fever. However, a more detailed medical report found in the archives of the Old Springfield Medical Society describes symptoms that hardly correspond to a simple fever. The patient exhibits periods of extreme agitation, alternating with profound lethargy. She reports disturbing visions and insists there is something within the walls watching her. The pupils remain dilated even under strong light, and the skin exhibits an abnormal pallor. Most disturbing is the fact that during episodes of delirium, she occasionally speaks in a language unknown to this physician. On February 14, 1891, Josiah did not attend Sunday service. Initially, no one gave much importance to the fact. Elderly people occasionally fall ill or simply decide to stay home. But when his absence extended to 3 consecutive Sundays, Reverend Silas Holloway decided to send his caretaker, Ephraim Ketch, to check on the widower's welfare. Reverend Holloway was not a man who easily intruded into the affairs of his congregation, especially those belonging to the founding families of the county. According to his personal journals, kept in the Regional Historical Society's archives, he nurtured a peculiar respect for Josiah, mixed with something that could be described as apprehension. In an entry dated February 1889, he writes, "Today I received J. Langley's confession. As always, his confessions are formal and contained, almost rehearsed. However, today I noticed something different in his eyes, a feverish gleam that doesn't match his usual composure. When I inquired about his health, he replied only that the nights have grown long." At the end, he asked me something unusual. He wanted to know if I believed the dead could return not by divine work, but through the force of an earthly promise. I answered with Scripture naturally, but the question troubled me for the remainder of the day. What Ephraim found, or, more precisely, what he didn't find, would set in motion a series of events that would profoundly mark the memory of the county, even though, as the years passed, many would prefer to forget. As stated in the sheriff's report dated March 4, 1891, filed at the Taney County Courthouse and later transferred to the State Historical Archive, Ephraim knocked at the door of the Langley cabin for many minutes without receiving a response. Noticing that the door wasn't locked, merely closed, the caretaker decided to enter, calling out Josiah's name. The interior of the cabin was impeccably clean and organized, as if it had been prepared to receive visitors. In the sitting room, on a side table, sat a half-empty cup of tea, long gone cold. No sign of struggle or disorder. No sign of Josiah. The sheriff's report, written by Deputy Clerk Ambrose Whitaker under dictation from Sheriff Zachariah McIntosh, describes the scene with an almost clinical objectivity, but includes a curious detail. The caretaker reports that upon entering the residence, he noticed that all the timepieces in the house were stopped at exactly 3:17, including the mantel clock in the parlor, the pocket watch on the desk in the study, and even the small bedside clock in the main bedroom. Mr. Ketch states that this detail caused him particular discomfort, though he couldn't explain why. Ephraim searched every room of the house, parlor, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, study, without finding the owner. As he later reported to the sheriff, it was in the root cellar that he noticed something unusual. An old chest of dark wood, the kind used to store clothing or keepsakes, stood open, something uncommon considering that Josiah was known to keep all his possessions carefully stored and locked. The root cellar of the residence deserves a more detailed description, as its unusual configuration would later become an object of interest for investigators. Unlike typical cellars of frontier homesteads of the time, generally simple storage spaces with packed dirt floors, the cellar of the Langley cabin had been constructed with evident attention to detail. The floor was of cut stone, the walls lined with a type of mortar that, according to experts consulted years later, contained unusual components that made it exceptionally resistant to moisture. Light was provided by small barred windows at ground level, positioned in such a way that even on overcast days the space received sufficient illumination. Most curious, however, was the division of the space. Although the cabin occupied a considerable area, the accessible cellar corresponded to only about half of this area. The other half, according to architectural drawings from the period, would simply be compacted earth. However, the wall that separated the 2 sections wasn't aligned with any wall of the upper house, creating an asymmetrical layout that intrigued architects who later studied the case. More intriguing still was the small door of dark wood, almost imperceptible, installed in the dividing wall, always kept locked by Josiah. Inside the chest, Ephraim found only a book with a black cover, apparently a diary. Flipping through it quickly, he noticed that the pages were filled with elegant, precise handwriting, undoubtedly Josiah's. However, something caught his attention. In the last written pages, The handwriting became progressively more tremulous, almost illegible, as if recorded by someone under extreme stress or fear. The caretaker took the book with him and went directly to the sheriff's office, where he reported the old man's disappearance to Sheriff McIntosh. Sheriff Zachariah McIntosh wasn't known for his investigative zeal. At 61, he occupied the position more due to his political connections than professional competence. A former militia lieutenant of intermediate rank, he had been appointed sheriff in 1882 after supporting the winning faction in a local electoral dispute. His track record of solved cases was mediocre, especially when involving influential families in the region. A journalist of the time, Wilbur Crabtree, described him in a column as a man who prefers the comfort of his armchair to the inconvenience of truth. The official investigation into Josiah's disappearance was superficial and brief. After 3 days of searching the property and surroundings without finding any trace of the elderly man, Sheriff McIntosh concluded that he had probably traveled to visit relatives in Springfield without informing anyone. The case was archived, and the cabin on Cutter's Ridge was closed, awaiting the owner's return. The investigation reports, though succinct, mention a detail that didn't receive proper attention at the time. During the inspection of the property, deputies found all of Josiah's clothes and personal belongings intact in the wardrobes. His valuables box contained all the items cataloged in his personal inventory, including valuable pieces such as a silver pocket watch and a set of ivory cufflinks that, according to witnesses, he greatly valued as they had been gifts from his late wife. In the drawer of his desk, a wallet containing a considerable sum of money remained untouched. If the widower had truly traveled of his own volition, he had departed without taking any belongings or resources. However, the diary found by Ephraim was never annexed to the official process. Sheriff McIntosh claimed to have returned it to the Reverend's caretaker, who in turn affirmed he had never received it back. For decades, the whereabouts of this document remained unknown until in 1964, during the renovation of an old parish house in Cutter's Ridge, a carpenter named Wesley Gaines found a wooden box embedded in a false wall. Inside the box, wrapped in a piece of black silk, was Josiah's diary. The discovery was initially kept secret by the carpenter, who, superstitious, feared the object might be connected to some unorthodox religious practice. It was only 3 months later, upon overhearing a casual conversation about the old mystery of the vanished widower, that Wesley decided to reveal his discovery to his employer, engineer Harlan Morris, who in turn informed the ecclesiastical authorities. Reverend Thaddeus Crawford, responsible for the parish at that time, took possession of the document and, after reading its contents, decided to deliver it to the history department at the University of Missouri. However, for reasons never officially clarified, the diary was archived in the restricted documents section of the university library, where it remained inaccessible to the public for another 5 years. Reverend Crawford, an educated and methodical man trained in theology at Princeton Seminary, was not given to superstitions or unnecessary alarms. This makes even more intriguing the content of a letter he sent to the Bishop of Springfield along with his request to transfer the diary to the university. In the letter, partially preserved in the diocesan archives, he writes, "Your Excellency will understand my hesitation in deciding the appropriate fate for this document. Its content, especially in the final pages, raises questions that transcend the scope of our common theological understanding. I do not suggest anything of a supernatural nature. I am, as you know, averse to such explanations, but there is in these pages a testimony to something profoundly disturbing, which, I believe, should be studied by minds prepared for deeper psychological and historical analyses. What concerns me is not so much what is written, but the evident transformation in the person who wrote it." In 1969, Professor Montgomery Wells, during research on the social history of the Ozarks in the late 19th century, obtained authorization to consult the document. What he found in the yellowed pages of Josiah's diary disturbed him profoundly, leading him to abandon his original research and dedicate himself exclusively to the study of this case. Montgomery Wells wasn't just a competent historian, but also a meticulous researcher with secondary training in psychology. Born in 1921 in Joplin, he had served briefly in the Army during World War II before dedicating himself to academic life. His specialty was documenting oral histories and analyzing personal documents, such as letters and diaries, to reconstruct social and psychological aspects of historical periods. When he gained access to Josiah's diary, he was working on a broad study of social transformations in the Ozarks at the turn of the century. The first entries in the diary dated from January 1877, shortly after Constance's death. They were mundane notes about the day-to-day life of a widower, lists of chores, expense records, occasionally reflections on solitude and loss. The handwriting was firm, organized, reflecting the methodical personality that acquaintances attributed to Josiah. An entry from March 1877 offers a glimpse into the routine and mental state of the widower at that time. March 17, 1877. Today, I received a visit from Mr. Halliwell, attorney, to address pending matters of the estate. The papers are in order, as Constance always maintained. The cabin, the lands in Shannon County, and the shares in the timber company remain as solid assets, sufficient to maintain me comfortably for the remainder of my days. I feel grateful for this, but would trade all this material security for a few more years by her side. The nights are especially difficult. The house seems larger and emptier. Sometimes I wake thinking I've heard her voice calling me from the study as she did when she worked late into the evening. The doctor recommended I take valerian drops to aid sleep, but I hesitate. I prefer the lucidity of pain to the confusion induced by remedies. Over the following months, the entries follow a similar pattern, documenting Josiah's gradual adaptation to his new reality as a widower. He mentions occasional visits from acquaintances, decisions about the administration of his property, and reflections on mourning. A recurring theme is his reluctance to modify any aspect of the house or dispose of his wife's belongings, as if preserving the physical environment could, somehow, keep her presence alive. A curious entry from August 1877 mentions the root cellar of the house for the first time, August 22, 1877. I needed to go down to the cellar today to fetch some preserves for dinner with Judge Preston. I hadn't entered there since Constance's death. She always insisted on being the only one to manage that particular storage area. Strangely, I found the small door at the back ajar, though I am certain it should have been locked. The key, which Constance always carried with her, was in the lock. I didn't dare look at what lies beyond it. I never entered that compartment. Constance said it was merely a storage for old family objects, things without value, but which she didn't have the heart to discard. I closed the door, removed the key, and now keep it with me. Tomorrow I will ask Jeremiah to check if there is some external entrance that might explain how that door came to be open. However, beginning in November 1890, the tone of the entries began to change subtly. Josiah started to record strange sensations, nocturnal noises he couldn't identify, a persistent feeling of being watched, objects that seemed to change position when he wasn't looking. November 16, 1890, again that sound like nails scratching wood coming from the walls. I asked Jeremiah to check for possible rats, but he found no trace. Perhaps it's just the old house settling, as he suggested. But why always at midnight? Jeremiah Talbot was the handyman who worked for Josiah 3 times a week. According to county employment records, he left service at the Langley cabin in December 1890, claiming to have found a better position at a farm on the outskirts of the county. However, when Professor Wells managed to locate a relative of Jeremiah, Augusta Talbot, in 1969, she told a different story. Jeremiah never spoke about that cabin, nor about the old gentleman. When we asked why he had left a stable job in the county to work so far away, he would only say there were things money couldn't compensate for. The night before departing for the farm, I heard him tell his wife that the walls of that cabin had eyes and ears. We never understood what he meant by that. Augusta also revealed to Professor Wells a disturbing detail that doesn't appear in any official record. Her father, a previously healthy and robust man, began to waste away shortly after leaving employment at Josiah's cabin. It was as if something consumed him from within, she described. He lost weight, lost his appetite, and at night suffered from nightmares so intense that he would scream until hoarse. Before dying, just 6 months after leaving that cabin, he raved about something that lived between the walls, and repeated, "I should not have looked, should not have opened that door." The entries in the diary became more disturbing as December progressed. Josiah reported having seen a dark figure standing at the foot of his bed during the night, which disappeared when he lit the oil lamp. He mentioned whispering voices that seemed to come from within the walls, speaking words he couldn't understand, but which somehow seemed directed at him. On January 2, 1891, he wrote, "I found that photograph again at the bottom of the dresser drawer, though I am certain I burned it 3 days ago. How is this possible? The image seems different now. Her eyes seem to follow me around the room. Tomorrow I will burn it again, and this time I will scatter the ashes in the garden." The photograph in question was never found, and the diary doesn't specify whose image it was. Considering that Josiah refers to the person in the photograph as her in capital letters, Professor Wells initially assumed it to be his late wife. However, later entries cast doubt on this interpretation. On January 5th, he writes, "I did not sleep again. The sounds in the walls continue, louder now, more insistent. They no longer seem like scratches, but rhythmic knocks, as if someone, or something, were trying to communicate through a code. I have made the decision to check the cellar tomorrow, the small door at the back, which has remained locked all these years. Perhaps there is something there that explains these phenomena. The key remains with me, kept in the jewelry box since that day in 1877. Constance made me promise never to open it, but she is no longer here to protect me from whatever may be on the other side. And what if what torments me is precisely there?" On January 6th, the entry is brief and disturbing. "I went down to the cellar today. The key was no longer in the jewelry box, though I am certain I left it there last night. I found it in the lock of the small door, as if someone had placed it there. The door was ajar. The smell that came from within, I cannot describe it adequately. A mixture of damp earth, mold, and something else, something metallic like old blood or oxidized iron. I didn't have the courage to open the door completely or enter. I locked it again and brought the key with me. Tonight, I will sleep with it under my pillow." On January 15th, Josiah reports a recurring dream, the same dream, for the 3rd consecutive night. "I stand before that door in the cellar, the one I always keep locked. In the dream, I know I shouldn't open it, but my hands move against my will. When the door opens, I see only darkness and feel an intense cold coming from within. Then, from the depths of that darkness, I hear that voice. Not Constance's, but the other, the one who promised to return. 'I am fulfilling my promise,' says the voice. And then I wake, always at 3:17 in the morning, with the sensation that someone is sitting on the edge of my bed." The reference to the other voice and the promise to return is particularly intriguing, as there is no previous mention in the diary of such a promise or who might have made it. Professor Wells dedicated considerable time trying to discover if there might be some secret door or hidden compartment in the cellar of the Langley cabin, but when he finally obtained permission to examine the property in May 1969, He discovered that the cellar had been completely filled in with concrete during a renovation carried out in 1926, when the cabin was briefly occupied by a family of merchants from St. Louis. This family, the Petersons, remained at the property for only 7 months, a notably short period considering the substantial investment they had made in renovating the cabin. Albert Peterson, patriarch of the family, was a successful merchant who had built a prosperous dry goods business. In 1926, at 54, he decided to acquire a residence that reflected his social status, and the old Langley cabin, which had remained closed for years, presented itself as an opportunity. Records of the time show that Peterson contracted architect William Hardin to supervise an extensive renovation of the property, including modernizations such as electrical installation and indoor plumbing. A curious detail appears in the architect's notes preserved in the County Public Archive. Client insisted on completely filling in the cellar after incident with the workers. I suggested keeping at least a section as a storage area, given the favorable climate, but Mr. Peterson was adamant. "I want that space permanently sealed," were his exact words. The incident mentioned is not detailed in the official notes, but Professor Wells gained some information through an assistant of William Hardin, the architect who worked on the renovation. According to this assistant, who accompanied the project, 2 workers who were removing debris from the cellar discovered a small door embedded in the back wall. Curious, they forced the lock and found a narrow compartment no larger than a closet. What they saw inside was never fully clarified, but both men abandoned the job the same day, refusing to return even when offered double pay. One of them, it is said, moved away from the county the following week. As the end of January approaches, the entries in the diary become more spaced out and fragmented. The handwriting begins to show signs of deterioration, with crossed-out words and stains that could be tears or spilled ink. On January 27th, there's a particularly disturbing entry. "I can no longer sleep. When I close my eyes, I feel her presence in the room." The walls are damp now, though it hasn't rained. The dampness forms patterns that look like watching faces. The smell, that same smell of wet earth and something else, something I recognize but cannot name. I should have burned all those objects when I had the chance. Now it is too late. Constance knew. She tried to warn me. An entry from January 29th contains an even more disturbing account. Someone, or something, has been walking through the house during the night. I hear the footsteps above my room, in the attic that has remained locked for years. The creaking of the floorboards is unmistakable. Last night I gathered courage to go up and check. The attic door was locked as always, the key kept in the drawer of my desk. But upon placing my ear against the wood, I clearly heard breathing from the other side, heavy and irregular. More disturbing still was that, as I moved away, the breathing stopped abruptly, as if whatever was in there knew I was listening. I returned to my room and locked the door. In the early hours, I woke to the sound of scratching at my door. It wasn't like an animal trying to enter, but something deliberate. 3 slow scratches, followed by 3 quicker ones. Then a pause, and the pattern would repeat. I remained motionless in bed, without the courage to check. The scratching continued for almost an hour, then ceased. In the morning I examined the door. There were no visible marks on the wood. On January 31st, Josiah makes a cryptic reference to a past event. "I've thought much about that night, the last in which Constance seemed truly lucid before the illness completely consumed her. She called me to the study late at night and handed me the key to that door in the cellar, making me swear never to open it. 'What we did was wrong, Josiah,' she said. 'I should never have brought that into our home. I should not have made that agreement.' I never knew what agreement she referred to. Constance always handled her private affairs independently, but I remember that in 1874, after returning from a journey to Kentucky, she changed. She became more reserved, spent hours alone in the cellar, and occasionally I heard her conversing down there, though I never saw anyone enter or leave. It was after this journey that the compartment at the back of the cellar was constructed, officially to store important documents. Now I wonder, what is really kept in there? The last regular entry dates from February 9, 1891. I found marks on the cellar floor today as if something heavy had been dragged toward that door. I didn't enter there. I cannot. But I know I must face her eventually. The voices are louder now, almost clear enough to understand what they're saying. I think they are calling my name. Or perhaps it is just the wind. Tomorrow I will go to the church to speak with Reverend Holloway. Perhaps he can help. There is no record that Josiah actually sought out Reverend Silas Holloway. According to the parish visitor's book preserved in the archives of the diocese, his last confession occurred on January 26, 1891. However, there is an intriguing document in the Reverend's personal archives, a handwritten note on high-quality paper, signed by Josiah and dated February 10, 1891. Reverend Holloway, I beg forgiveness for not attending our scheduled meeting today. Unforeseen circumstances require my presence at home. The matter about which I intended to consult you has become more urgent than I imagined. I request your prayers, as I fear I am facing something that transcends my understanding and, perhaps, the very doctrine of the Church. If we do not see each other again in this world, know that I depart at peace with my conscience, though not necessarily at peace with what dwells between these walls. May God protect you, Josiah Langley. Reverend Holloway never mentioned this note publicly, and it was only discovered after his death in 1925 among his personal documents. After the entry of February 9th, there is an interval of almost a month without annotations. Then, on March 10th, 4 days before his absence was first noted, there is a final entry. The handwriting is almost unrecognizable, tremulous, and hurried, as if written by someone on the verge of collapse. She is here, in the house, with me. It is not Constance. It never was. The cellar door is open now. I wasn't the one who opened it. The sounds she makes as she moves through the walls. I can no longer stay, but where to go when she is everywhere? The photographs, all of them, even those I burned, have returned. The faces in the photos have changed. All have her eyes now. I must end this. There is only one way. This is the last clearly legible entry in the diary. On the final pages, there are only incoherent scribbles and what appear to be frustrated attempts to draw something, perhaps a face or a symbol. On the very last page, there is a single phrase written in a surprisingly clear and firm handwriting, so different from the previous text that it raised questions about whether it had been written by the same person. Finally, I understood what she wanted from the beginning. Professor Montgomery Wells spent the following years trying to construct a clearer chronology of events and determine what really happened to Josiah Langley. In his research notebooks, found after his death in 1975, he raises several hypotheses from supernatural explanations, which he himself dismissed as products of the fevered imagination of a lonely elderly man, to more mundane possibilities: an intruder who tormented the widower, some distant relative with interest in his inheritance, or even a case of progressive mental deterioration that culminated in flight or suicide. One of the aspects that most intrigued the professor was the coincidence between the recurring time in Josiah's dreams, 3:17, and the fact that all the clocks in the house were found stopped at this same time. This coincidence suggested that something significant had occurred at that specific moment, possibly on the night before his disappearance. Another disturbing element that Wells highlighted in his notes was the final phrase of the diary. The handwriting of that last entry, so different from the rest, raised questions about its authenticity. Would it be possible that someone else had written that line? And if so, who? And what would be the meaning of that understanding mentioned? One of the most intriguing aspects that Wells discovered during his investigation were the death records of Constance Langley. According to the official document, she died of natural causes on January 12, 1877. However, upon examining the archives of the Old Springfield Medical Society, the professor found a medical report that offered additional details. Constance had suffered from a mysterious ailment that caused severe hallucinations in the weeks prior to her death. The responsible physician, Dr. Abraham Finch, described that the patient frequently spoke about something that lived inside the walls, and insisted she had made an agreement that could not be fulfilled. This medical report, dated January 10, 1877, includes additional observations that Wells considered particularly relevant. The patient alternates between periods of lucidity and episodes of extreme agitation. During moments of mental clarity, she expresses a rational and consistent fear related to an agreement she would have made during her journey to Kentucky in 1874. Although reluctant to provide specific details, she mentioned having acquired an ancient object from a trader in Louisville, an object she now keeps stored in a special compartment in her residence. More concerning is her insistence that this object is not inanimate. Mrs. Langley, a woman of education and respectable social position, does not seem to me given to superstitions. However, she describes with disturbing conviction that the object changed after being brought to her home, and that it now communicates with her through the walls. When questioned about the nature of these communications, the patient becomes extremely agitated, refusing to elaborate. In the last 48 hours, her physical state has deteriorated significantly. She presents permanently dilated pupils, even under intense light, abnormally low body temperature, and a peculiar odor emanating from the skin that does not correspond to any pathological condition known to this physician. There are also inexplicable marks on the forearms and neck, similar to bruises, but with a regular pattern that suggests more a deliberate contact than accidental injuries. As a doctor, I should record only observable facts, but I confess that this case defies my scientific understanding. If I were a man of lesser education, I might suggest that Mrs. Langley is under some kind of malevolent influence. As I am not, I limit myself to documenting her condition and administering the prescribed sedatives to alleviate her suffering, though I fear the outcome is inevitably fatal. Ois. Constance died 2 days after the drafting of this report. The death certificate, signed by the same Dr. Abraham Finch, lists cardiac arrest as the cause of death, omitting all the disturbing details documented in the hospital report. During his research, Professor Wells also interviewed several elderly residents of the county, including Millicent Haskell, who in 1891 was a young woman of 20 who lived near the Langley cabin. According to Millicent's testimony recorded in 1969, in those days nobody openly spoke about the old gentleman's cabin, but everyone knew there was something strange there. My mother forbade me from passing in front of that house alone. On full moon nights, sometimes we would hear sounds coming from there. Not screams, nor exactly voices, but a kind of low lamentation, like someone humming a sad melody. On the morning they discovered he had disappeared, I was returning from the general store and saw something I never told the authorities. I saw a woman leaving the house very early, before the sun had even risen. She wore a bonnet that covered her face and carried something in her arms, wrapped in a dark cloth. At the time, I thought it might be a doctor, perhaps, who had been called during the night. But now, thinking about it, why would a doctor leave carrying something like that, instead of simply doing their work and leaving? This testimony raises disturbing questions about the events of that morning. Who was the woman seen by Millicent? What was she carrying? And why did this information never reach the official authorities? In a notation following the interview with Millicent, Professor Wells writes, "The description of the woman seen by M.H. curiously corresponds to reports of a stranger who was occasionally seen visiting Constance in the months preceding her death. According to Ephraim Ketch, this visitor never identified themselves. Always arrived after sunset, and Constance insisted on receiving them alone in the study or cellar. The caretaker described her as a thin woman, very pale, of considerable height, always dressed in dark clothing and a bonnet with a wide brim that shaded her face. Coincidence, or would it be possible that the same individual was somehow connected to both the death of Constance and the disappearance of her husband 14 years later? The Langley cabin on Cutter's Ridge remained closed for many years after Josiah's disappearance. In 1926, it was acquired by the merchant Albert Peterson, who carried out extensive renovations before moving in with his family. Curiously, the Petersons occupied the property for only 7 months before suddenly moving, selling the cabin for a price well below market value. When questioned about the reasons for the move, Albert Peterson reportedly said only that the cabin was not suitable for a family with peace of mind. During the interview he gave to Professor Wells in 1969, Albert Peterson, then 97 years old and residing in Chicago, showed extreme reluctance to discuss his brief occupation of the Langley cabin. Only after much insistence did he agree to provide some details, with the express condition that the conversation not be recorded. According to Wells's notes, Peterson reported that in the first weeks after the move, the family was enthusiastic about the new residence. The renovation had been extensive, modernizing the cabin without compromising its historical character. However, after approximately a month, inexplicable events began to occur. At first they were small things, Peterson is said to have said, objects that disappeared and reappeared in different places. Strange sounds in the walls like scratches or rhythmic knocks. My wife complained of a persistent odor in the master bedroom, a smell of damp earth and something metallic that no cleaning could eliminate. We replaced the flooring, checked plumbing, even removed part of the wall covering, but the smell all was returned. The incident that finally motivated the move, according to Peterson, occurred on a night in July 1926. His wife woke up screaming, claiming to have seen a dark figure standing at the foot of the bed. When Peterson lit the lamp, there was no one there. However, on the dresser, they found an object that didn't belong to them, a small carved wooden box containing a single photograph. It was a photograph of an elderly man seated in a chair, said Peterson. Behind him, there was something like a shadow, but with a vaguely human form. Most disturbing were the man's eyes. They were completely black, like holes in the image. I immediately recognized him as the former owner, Josiah Langley, whose portrait I had seen at the county clerk's office when we signed the purchase papers. On the back of the photograph was a phrase written, "She lives in the walls and wants company." The following morning, Peterson contracted workers to completely fill in the cellar with concrete, especially the hidden compartment that had been discovered during the renovation. A week later, the family left the cabin, never returning even to retrieve many of the personal items they left behind. In the years that followed, the property passed through various owners, none remaining for more than 2 years. In 1952, after sitting empty for almost a decade, it was finally demolished to make way for a small commercial building, which initially housed a general store and later a fabric shop. During the demolition, as reported in the Taney County Times of July 17, 1952, the workers made a macabre discovery. Upon removing the concrete floor of what had been the cellar, they found a small wooden door, sealed with what appeared to be black wax. The foreman of the work, Josiah Dawkins, decided to open the door, revealing a small compartment, no larger than a closet. Inside, there were only 3 items: an old box of matches, a broken perfume bottle, and a faded photograph. The news report doesn't offer details about the content of the photograph, mentioning only that it was delivered to the authorities. However, there is no record of this photograph in the police archives of the time. The only clue to its possible content comes from an interview given by Josiah Dawkins himself to Professor Wells in 1968. I'll never forget that image as long as I live. It was a photograph of an elderly man, probably this Josiah Langley, seated in a chair. Behind him, there was an obscure figure, like a shadow with human form. Most disturbing were the eyes of the man in the photo. They were completely black, as if someone had covered them with ink. And there was a message written on the back of the photograph, but it was so faded that I could only make out a few words. Fulfilled, promise, within, walls. Dawkins also revealed a detail he omitted from the press at the time. Next to the photograph, they found what appeared to be a small box of carved bone, similar to an ancient reliquary. The box was empty except for a thin layer of dark dust at the bottom. When asked what happened to this object, Dawkins confessed to having been disturbed by the discovery and decided to burn it that same night, along with the box of matches. The photograph, being potentially relevant to the old case of the disappearance, was the only thing he delivered to the authorities. Professor Montgomery Wells died in September 1975 before completing his research on the case of Josiah Langley. His notes and collected materials were donated to the university library, but inexplicably, a large part of this collection disappeared during a reorganization of the archive in 1968, leaving only some field notebooks and correspondence. The inexplicable loss of these documents, ironically similar to the disappearance of Josiah's original diary from police records, was attributed to an administrative error by the library management. However, Edith Montgomery, the professor's assistant who helped him catalog the material before the donation, expressed doubts about this explanation. We meticulously organized the entire collection related to the case. There were more than 12 notebooks of annotations, photographs of the cabin before the demolition, copies of official documents, transcriptions of interviews, all cataloged in 3 file boxes with clear labels. The professor was extremely methodical. It's simply impossible that all this material was lost through a common bureaucratic error. In one of the remaining notebooks, dated August 1969, Wells records a disturbing personal experience. After months investigating the case, he began to suffer from insomnia and hear strange sounds in his own home. Scratches on the walls, footsteps in the hallway when he was alone, the creaking of a rocking chair in his study, though he owned no such furniture. In his last known annotation about the case, he writes, "I dreamed of him last night." Josiah was standing in the cellar of the cabin on Cutter's Ridge, before that door. He looked directly at me and said, "You too made a promise, Professor." When I woke, I found a box of matches identical to the one described in the demolition report on my desk. I don't know how it got there. My house was locked. Tomorrow I will end this research. There are questions that should not be answered, mysteries that should remain buried. Josiah understood this too late. I still have time. Professor Wells formally abandoned his research on the case of Josiah Langley shortly after this incident, returning to his previous studies on the social history of Missouri. He rarely mentioned the subject, and when questioned, would say only that he had lost interest in the story. A curious detail, documented by his assistant Edith, is that the professor insisted on burning all his notebooks of annotations related to the case that were still in his personal possession. The assistant also reported a change in his behavior after abandoning the research. He began to avoid working after nightfall, installed additional lighting in his home, and developed an almost phobic aversion to enclosed spaces such as cellars and attics. The truth about what happened to Josiah Langley in February 1891 remains a mystery. His body was never found. No concrete evidence of crime was established. The official records continue to list his case as a disappearance. In 1960, a journalist from the Springfield Register named Howard Bennett attempted to reopen the investigation, fascinated by the urban legend that had formed around the widower's cabin, as it was locally known. He managed to locate and interview Ephraim Ketch, the Reverend's caretaker who had found the house empty in 1891. Ephraim, then 89 years old, showed signs of senile dementia, but in moments of lucidity told Bennett something he had never officially mentioned. When I entered that cabin, I immediately felt that something was wrong. It wasn't just the silence or the absence of the gentleman. It was as if the house were breathing. The walls seemed to pulse subtly, like a heart beating very slowly, and there was a smell, not of decomposition or illness, but of freshly dug earth and candle wax. The strangest was what I found in his room. The bed was perfectly made, as if no one had slept in it. On the pillow there was a single object, an old key, large, probably to the cellar, and beside the key, almost imperceptible against the white of the sheet, small stains of a dark liquid that I preferred to believe was ink. Ephraim also revealed to the journalist a detail he had omitted from the sheriff in 1891 for fear of being considered superstitious or mentally unstable. When I went down to the cellar to check if Josiah might be there, I noticed that the small door at the back, the one he always kept locked, was ajar. The strong smell of damp earth came from there. I approached with fear, but something impelled me to look. The compartment beyond the door was small, like a closet built into the wall, but it seemed to extend deeper than the structure of the house would allow. The inner walls were of compacted earth, not masonry like the rest of the cellar. In the center there was an object I couldn't immediately identify. It seemed to be a small carved box made of some material that was neither wood nor metal. Beside it, a photograph turned face down. I didn't touch anything. Something in that place caused me an instinctive dread, something I cannot explain. I closed the door, ran up the stairs, and never returned to that cabin. Howard Bennett's article about the case was published in a Sunday edition of the Springfield Register in July 1960, but didn't generate the interest he had hoped for. The story had become just another urban legend among so many others that populated the county's imagination. Bennett himself soon moved on to other subjects, and the mystery of Josiah Langley was again relegated to oblivion. A disturbing coincidence, not publicly recorded, was the sudden death of Howard Bennett just 3 months after the publication of his article. According to the death certificate, he died in his sleep, victim of a heart attack, at 42 years of age. A newsroom colleague, however, confided to Professor Wells that in the weeks prior to his death, Bennett had become increasingly paranoid, claiming to hear strange sounds in his apartment and feeling constantly watched. He also mentioned having found, without explanation, an old box of matches on his desk, similar to the one described in the demolition report of the cabin. Today, the site where the Langley cabin once stood houses a small department store. The oldest employees occasionally comment on strange nocturnal occurrences, merchandise that changes place, sounds of footsteps on the upper floor when the establishment is empty, and, occasionally, the persistent aroma of old perfume that seems to emanate from the walls. The current manager, Margaret Reynolds, who has worked at the location since 1998, reports that these occurrences intensify during certain times of the year, particularly in February, the month of Josiah's disappearance. It's something that everyone who works here for some time ends up noticing. It's not frightening. It's more uncomfortable. As if you're never really alone in the building, even when you clearly are. Some employees refuse to close the store alone, especially on Mondays. I don't know why specifically on Mondays, but it's when the strange things seem to happen most frequently. The air gets heavier, like before a storm, and that smell of old perfume appears, a sweet aroma, but with an underlying note of damp earth. And sometimes, just for an instant, you have the sensation of seeing someone from the corner of your eye, usually near the staircase that once led to the cellar. When you turn, there's no one there. Recently, in 2023, during a renovation of the store's floor, workers found, embedded in the concrete, a small silver medallion with the inscription JL 1891. The object was donated to the County Historical Museum, where it remains on display, a silent reminder that some secrets resist the passage of time. Curiously, the museum employee responsible for cataloging the piece, Harrison Wells, reported a strange incident related to the medallion. According to him, on the first night after the item was placed on exhibit, the museum's security cameras recorded an inexplicable failure precisely at 3:17 in the morning, lasting exactly 7 minutes. When the system began functioning again, the medallion had moved inside the display case, rotating 180 degrees. Technicians examined the system and found no explanation for the failure. What really happened to Josiah Langley in that cabin on Cutter's Ridge? Was he the victim of a common crime committed by someone interested in his fortune? Did he succumb to madness and isolation, fleeing or taking his own life? Or is there something darker in this story, something that official records and rational explanations cannot fully capture? Perhaps the answer lies in the last legible words of his diary. Finally, I understood what she wanted from the beginning. What would this late understanding be? And who, or what, was she? Professor Wells, in his final notes on the case, offers an intriguing perspective. After months of investigation, I find myself contemplating possibilities that my academic training hesitates to accept. The patterns are undeniable, the black eyes in the photographs, the persistent smell of damp earth and metal, the sounds in the walls, the specific time, 3:17, that appears repeatedly, the sensation of being watched, the progressive mental deterioration of people who delve into the mystery, and, most disturbing, the obscure figure consistently described by witnesses separated by decades. There is an element in this case that resists conventional explanations, something that seems to persist beyond the demolition of the cabin, beyond the death of the original witnesses, beyond even time itself, like an echo that refuses to dissipate, or a presence that has found a way to transcend the physical limits that should contain it. I dare not fully articulate what I suspect, but the last phrase in Josiah's diary, "Finally, I understood what she wanted from the beginning," continues to resonate. What did he understand? And why did this understanding coincide with his disappearance? There exists an old concept in Ozark folklore, rarely discussed openly, called a bargainer. A being that is not exactly human, that makes agreements, grants wishes, but eventually returns to collect a payment much more valuable than the beneficiary initially perceives. Would it be possible that Constance, during her mysterious journey to Kentucky, encountered something of this nature? Something she brought home, confining it in that sealed compartment in the cellar, only to discover too late that some entities cannot be truly contained. Pure speculation, naturally? The most likely explanation remains a conventional crime or a tragic case of mental instability. However, I cannot ignore the chill I feel when rereading the accounts, nor the persistent sensation that, by investigating this mystery, I have attracted some kind of unwanted attention. Some stories don't have a definitive conclusion, only echoes that resonate through the decades, reminding us that not all mysteries were made to be unraveled. The case of Josiah Langley is one of those echoes, a whisper from the past that, even after more than a century, still makes us look with suspicion at old walls and dark cellars, wondering what might be hidden beyond appearances. And if, by chance, you find yourself walking through the historic roads of Taney County at dusk and feel a sudden chill, as if being watched, if you perceive a vague aroma of old perfume in the air, perhaps it's merely coincidence, or perhaps it's a reminder that some presences never really leave, some promises once made are impossible to break. There exists an old saying in the Ozarks, "Not all stories end when the person dies." In the case of Josiah Langley, it seems the story only began with his disappearance, and perhaps, in some sense we don't fully understand, continues even today. And you, who now know this story, have you checked the walls of your house today? Have you paid attention to the sounds that come from them when everything is silent? And if, by chance, you wake at 3:17 in the morning, perhaps it would be prudent to avoid looking at the dark corners of your room. Some things once seen cannot be forgotten. Some stories once known become part of us. As the elders used to say, knowledge is power, but some knowledge is also a burden, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again.